All right, the Department of Homeland Security Press Secretary Dave Lapan. Secretary, good to have you. I mentioned, sir, the San Juan mayor and the president did ultimately agree to include her in this discussion. I don't know whether in the end that would have been his call, but that despite her criticisms, did you have a role in that, or did your boss have a role in that to make sure that she would be at least among those invited on this discussion?
Well, thanks, Neil. We at the Department of Homeland Security, as well as FEMA, Administrator Long, who's there that you heard from, has been reaching out. We continue to reach out to all the local officials, to include the mayor of San Juan. We have very close relations with the governor of Puerto Rico, and our Emergency Operations Center is based there in San Juan, so we have continually reached out to the mayor to ensure that she's involved in part of the process as we plan and distribute aid.
Okay, because she had made, as I'm sure you're aware, a fuss over being included in a conference call yesterday, but her phone was muted. In other words, she couldn't weigh in. She could listen, I guess. But this was something that was coordinated with officials on the ground there and those at Homeland Security, sort of getting apprised to the latest rescue recovery efforts. Is that true? That was her phone deliberately muted so she couldn't participate?
I couldn't tell you. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, you don't sound like a guy who would do that. But let me ask you about where this goes right now. The president, of course, and it's human nature, would chafe at criticism that for this particular disaster, he wasn't up to snuff. She said that he did note the complications here dealing with an island. It isn't like a state where neighboring states and those sympathetic could come and help. But that help was later than would normally and ideally be the case. Whose fault is that?
So at this point, again, we're not looking to assert blame. We are moving forward every day, as was said during the press conference, actually by the Congresswoman. FEMA has had individuals, the Coast Guard has had individuals on the ground, first through the first hurricane, which was Irma, stayed on the ground for Maria, and again, the conditions on the ground after it was a direct hit to the island have certainly complicated our efforts to distribute aid throughout the island. That has certainly made things slower than what we'd like to see, but every day we're gaining more and more. What was
going on there? So the reason why I mentioned it is the president mentioned the same thing. He said poor leadership ability by, in this case, he said at the time, the mayor of San Juan and others in Puerto Rico who are not able to get their workers to help. What did he mean by that? Were you referring to that?
No, and again, we understand that many of the individuals on the island, to include local government officials, have been personally impacted by the storm. They are victims and survivors themselves. So in other previous storms where you've had local officials with emergency operations centers up and running, especially in large states like Texas and Florida, where you have parts of the state unaffected by the storm. Here in Puerto Rico, everyone was affected by the storm. So you had local officials that weren't able to very quickly help to coordinate efforts. You had, again, truck drivers and local workers that are caring for their families and are not able to come to assistance. And again, unlike in what we saw in Harvey and Irma, you couldn't have drivers and folks with boats just come next door and drive over as they did in those. So you had to rely on locals, again, who are impacted themselves by the storm. So it's been slower than we would like, but we're getting there.
All right. So when you hear the criticism the president and the administration collectively has had from those on the left, and that isn't too shocking, maybe the same would apply to Mayor Cruz in San Juan when she said it was too little too late. Elizabeth Warren said there is no dollar estimate for what is needed because there is no plan in place, or Senator Richard Blumenthal blasting the Puerto Rico help is not helpful. Lin-Manuel Miranda, the man, of course, behind Hamilton, who said that the president's comments indicate that he's insensitive and that he's going straight to hell. No long lines for you, Mr. President. Someone will say right this way. They'll even clear a path. What do you think of all that criticism?
So, again, for the folks, the professionals on the ground, to include the ones here in Washington, D.C., I think it was mentioned at FEMA headquarters. This is day 42 or 43, I think,
right,
of 24/7-hour operations. So we try not to pay attention to the criticism. It's going to come. We focus on the mission at hand, and that's what we're going to continue to do. Obviously, there's a freedom of speech in our country, which those in the military have fought to defend. So people are free to criticize and say what they do. We try not to let the criticism get in the way of doing what's right and getting the job done.
Do you think the president, just personal, went overboard to get the good story out? Because you're quite right. He's heard a lot of criticism, and his performance, for these early hurricanes in the continental U.S. was exemplary. Maybe he's chafing at the criticism he's gotten on Puerto Rico that might or might not be justified, to your point, sir, but that by showcasing a lot of people complimenting what he's doing, that it didn't look right. What do you think?
Well, I'd stay away from offering my personal opinion, but what I would say is that we're also looking for balance. There certainly are people in Puerto Rico who are desperately in need. That is undeniable. Nobody is trying to cover that over. But we also don't want to ignore the great work and the hard work that's being done. So a little balance is in order, I think.
Fair enough. David Lapan, thank you very, very much. Homeland Security Department Press Secretary.